All right, welcome to Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes, the show where we dig into the stories of the people shaping the future of app-based computing with a special focus on mobile. I'm your host, Matt Klein, co-founder and CTO of Bitdrift and creator of Envoy. Each episode, we'll talk with engineers, founders, and technical leaders who've transformed the way their companies build and understand what's happening inside their systems. We'll dig into the challenges, the breakthroughs, the lessons learned, and we'll wrap it all up with their hottest takes. So let's dive in. Today, I am thrilled to have fantastic engineer Keith Smiley, who's a software engineer currently focusing on developer experience. He spent 9 years at Lyft working on iOS tooling and now works at a company called Modular on Bazel and developer productivity. Welcome, Keith.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Keith, by the way, he's one of the best engineers that I have ever met. Fantastic engineer.
Thanks.
So I'm very excited to have Keith join us. And, you know, the way that we typically start these episodes is would love just to learn a little bit about your career journey. I mean, obviously you, I think, started at Lyft out of school, right? Is that correct? Or did you work somewhere before that? I actually don't remember.
Yeah, I had a few small jobs before that. Lyft was my first real big place, I like to say.
Yeah. And then I think what I would love to learn about is I know that, you and I both joined Lyft when it was still very small. And, I'm sure in the beginning of Lyft, you worked on a lot of things, but I guess would love to learn about, had you done mobile engineering prior to Lyft? Then obviously just tell us a little bit about how you got into mobile in the first place. And then, kind of what you did at Lyft. And then for those that don't know, Keith is a major contributor to the Bazel build system. So, he's well known as Bazel Keith. I just would love to learn about that journey, right? In terms of, how did you get into mobile? How did you wind up at Lyft? How did you wind up working on Bazel? So take us through it.
Yeah, sounds good. So I was interested in computers when at a young age, I think many developers you talk to. But unlike most folks, we actually grew up with Macs in the household. My dad worked for a company in the 90s where they had Macs in the time where that was a bad idea. I think they had them when they were good, and then they were really bad for a while, and they still had them. And so as they started to get rid of them and switch to Windows computers, we would get the runoff machines, which was kind of nice. And so I guess that's how I got into computer stuff. And so I always was using Macs. And at some point,
Wait, so sorry, I was gonna say, but this is not Apple II. This is is this the Mac with the clear thing on it, the one from the 90s where you could see through it? Is that what we're talking about here? So we did
have that one, but that was a little later. I don't know. Okay. I feel bad to not know if it what model these old ones were, but they were the old gray or beige boxes that you see typical from that era. Right. I don't know. I'm not sure if my parents would know at this point, or if anyone. It's probably just lost to time, what models those actually were, but. Yeah, it's really just to say that growing up with Macs meant we kind of always had them forever, because even though so that was pre Mac OS 10 transition. Once Mac OS 10 came out, we had those machines instead, and yeah, we had the clear Mac G3 or whatever that was purple or green or whatever. But yeah, all of that is really just to say that I started tinkering with computers on Macs, which I think was atypical at the time. And honestly, at the time, I had no idea what I was doing with any sort of programming and no idea how to figure out anything either. I guess this was pre-Stack Overflow, and I'm sure there were, I hear people these days talk about BBSs or whatever existed at that time, but I just didn't know what I didn't know there. So I mostly just tried to tinker around and make anything work with Objective-C, which was virtually impossible for someone who was in high school. Did you have books?
Because I remember back then people would go to Borders, and buy programming books. I mean, it's
I wish I had known
it's
to do that
funny
too.
to think about that right now, that people used to go buy programming books. I think I had some programming books. So I don't know. I mean, how did you learn? Did you have books, or you just kind of
I mostly just messed around with the sample projects that Apple had out there, and there was one forum that if you were looking at very targeted stuff, you could occasionally find good information on. And then I don't know, you could poke around a lot in the SDK, and once you had some sense of how anything worked, you could maybe find an API that was well named enough to try to do what you did. But realistically, I just wasn't doing anything particularly complex, and it was kind of fine. And so I spent some time doing that, which was interesting just because obviously Objective-C isn't like a particularly friendly like first language to spend a lot of time on. And obviously I had like since I had no idea what I was doing, like I'm sure I wasn't, managing memory correctly or whatever you had to deal with at that time.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, it definitely didn't for that, for my toy applications. From that, I, spent some time on like the other kind of beginner programming stuff, like WYSIWYG stuff, like Dreamweaver or whatever. I ended up going to college for computer science because I knew I was interested in it, even though I really didn't have like much of a background or like didn't really know anything at that time, which was obviously fine going into college. But yeah, so I guess I spent some more time on Apple stuff at that point. Like the iPhone had come out, and like so I was trying to mess around with that a little bit, still not doing anything particularly complex. But at that point, I guess like I was at least familiar with some APIs in the programming language, and I don't know, you started to find stuff on GitHub at that point. And I guess the big thing for me at that time was I wrote some code and like put it on GitHub or whatever, and ended up submitting it to CocoaPods, which was the biggest iOS package manager for a long time. It, honestly, is still huge, even though they're like shutting it down next year or something. And through contributing to CocoaPods, or like just my own libraries, the folks there were super interested in having like people contribute, and so they gave me commit access to that repo, which I felt heavily underqualified to have. But
Sorry,
I ended up
and is this while you were still at college that this was happening?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Got it.
Yeah. So I was maybe in my second year of college at this point, and so the way the CocoaPods works is like there was this giant repository called the specs repository that had like a centralized registry of like every single pod spec, which was like the definition for the library. And they were kind of giving out commit access to anybody who had pushed something. At some point they kind of realized maybe that wasn't the best idea as it started to grow. Yeah, and so instead,
sounds a bit shady from a security perspective.
Yeah.
I guess I was going to say, I guess back then people did not really think about supply chain attacks like they do today. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. But at some point, obviously that stopped. And like, so then folks who were working on CocoaPods were merging pull requests for that. And so I ended up doing a lot of that while I was in college and merging like thousands of these pull requests and it was just really lucky timing that CocoaPods got like really big at the time. And so I was working on that a bit, and then I guess through that just like met a lot of folks and like saw a lot of stuff that was going on in the iOS community, which was really great. I actually got a job in college at the place where my dad worked to work on an iOS app. This was still like really I don't know, like maybe 2013 or something, so it's like pretty early mobile days, but he was like kind of interested in this like app for I don't need to go into it, but it was like a pretty basic app of just like data presentation of like some database of stuff that was like on device or whatever. And that was a really good like learning ground for me to like build a real app for iOS, but I was entirely by myself. Again, like still not really with many helpful resources, but at least at this point, like there was Stack Overflow, there was so much code on GitHub at this point, even though it feels like nothing compared to today. So I spent a few years working on that, which is really great. And then I guess after college, like through the connections from the CocoaPod stuff, I was able to get a job in the Bay, like working on iOS stuff. And I like moved out to San Francisco like 2 days after I graduated from college and to work on iOS. And yeah, I worked at a small consultancy for a while and realized that maybe consulting wasn't really the best for me at that point in my career, since it was still super early and a lot of the projects were maybe like working by yourself, which wasn't really what I was hoping to do. I kind of wanted to like work with other people to like learn more from folks.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's when I also knew someone else at Lyft from the CocoaPods community, ended up switching to Lyft. So yeah, that was the journey there. Yeah, like you said, at Lyft, I started as a feature engineer. There was no infra team, of course, at the time that I started.
Yeah.
For folks who listened to the other episodes of this podcast, I guess like I started when Martin was working on this rewrite in secret, but I was of course working on the like Objective-C code base that would become the legacy code base, I guess. So yeah, I was working on features there for a while, and then things changed when we like shipped the rewrite or got closer and closer to doing that. So
yeah, well, and sorry for those that have not listened to their episode, what you're referring to is Lyft, like many companies at the time, had an Objective-C app, and Martin, my co-founder, rewrote the entire app in Swift, which was a brand new language at the time. And I think I had asked Martin the same thing, but I'm sure you have a lot of memories of Swift compiler issues and things along those lines. I mean, would love any stories that you have from that time.
Yeah, I think Martin has all the best ones, but since he doesn't love doing these things, like I think I've ended up telling a lot of those. Or after we shipped the rewrite, like I did a talk about the rewrite, even though he was the one who did the rewrite, which felt pretty silly. And now like all these people thought that I did it or something. But yeah, I mean, there was so much interesting stuff at that time because just everything was broken in interesting ways. And, so Chris Latner, who, rewrote or wrote Swift by him or started that project by himself at Apple, he's the founder of Modular where I currently work. And since then he's gone on many podcasts talking about how there were no major consumers of Swift at Apple and how that was like a mistake in the process of shipping it, which obviously is very easy to say in retrospect. And I think that maybe that was a really good learning for them. But I think the funny part was that at that time, like the Lyft codebase was definitely the largest Swift codebase out there because Martin was working on this pre 1.0 when he started, and like it was still in beta, and then we shipped it at like Swift 1.1 or something, which was just a few months after it was 1.0'd.
Yeah.
So
I mean, what's really interesting to me, and this is totally anecdotal, but I feel like to this day, Swift has more compiler bugs than I would expect, like for a pretty mature language. And again, that could just be my anecdotal experience, right? It's like the number of times in my career that I have faced like a C++ compiler bug or a Rust compiler bug is pretty rare. I mean, it's like it's happened to me probably less than 5 times my entire career. But I feel like the Swift stuff happens a lot. And I'm actually curious, like, why do you think it's because that it's not, at least historically, it was not used very much within Apple, like, or do you think that there's other things going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, at this point, it's used enough in Apple that I feel like there shouldn't be any reason that the like patterns you might use outside are any different from what is also being used in Apple.
Right.
Like, I don't think it's not like Apple's culture is such that all the code bases look the same or something. Like, they're very insular between teams, right? So people can kind of do whatever they want. For us, it always felt like we were just doing things in a way that was just slightly outside of maybe what they expected. Like, there's a big thing in the early days of Swift about more like functional programming concepts, since it had this really strong type system, and maybe you could do stuff that way. And people went to this extreme where they were maybe doing stuff like you would do in Haskell or something like that.
Right.
And I think that stuff was like super unexpected to them. And I think there's still patterns like that exist in the community, but not Apple. But I don't really think that should be the case anymore. But, for example, all these people use this library RX Swift that gives you these like RX concepts in the language or whatever. And you can end up in the situations where you have like hugely nested chains of these things with many types and all of this. And that always hits issues.
I mean, it's just even at Bitdrift, like within the last 3 years, we've had at least one, if not 2 issues that were explained to me as Swift miscompile issues. And it's more just, again, it just seems odd to me that for a pretty mature language that it's now widely used, that us as a pretty small company, we don't even have that much Swift code. Like most of our code is actually written in Rust, that we would be hitting issues like that. But anyway, yeah, sorry. Keep going.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting, like, skip ahead to, a few later on at Lyft. Being able to work on that stuff was really nice because, I could dedicate some time to trying to fix some issues like that we would hit, which was really great. But yeah, I guess going back a little bit, like, so, after the rewrite or towards the rewrite, we started kind of everyone moved over to that. And then after the rewrite shipped, we kind of founded a small infra team, and I was on that with maybe one other person for quite a while. And I guess since that point, I pretty much worked on infra stuff for the rest of the time at Lyft. At that point, it was much more like typical, how do we make libraries that are more reusable for folks and like patterns and stuff like that, because the code base was so, young. And, Martin did a great job, but obviously you start to grow and you add features and there's like new patterns that emerge. So yep. I spent a lot of time on that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of other various maintenance work in that process too. Yeah. So, that team grew and grew as the company grew. And at some point we split into multiple teams, one that was like more focused on those libraries and like architecture and stuff, and one was more focused on tooling, and I was working on the tooling side. And there was a brief stint in there where maybe we like kind of sort of rewrote the UI of the app again, which Martin also maybe talked about more in the previous episode if people are more interested in that. But and so I guess I kind of did that for a year, but then came back to tooling after that part. And I guess this was, 2018 or something like that. And from that point we had, gone from 25 iOS engineers to 75 or something, like over the course of a year or something like that, or I don't know. So things really like ramped up in an interesting way with how the code base and the team and the company were scaling, especially because, you know, like many companies, Lyft had this like vertical team structure, except when it came to mobile, because everyone ships everything in the same binary. So that really like changed a lot of how you thought about developer experience. And, you know, so at this time we started hitting kind of the classic issues you'd expect in a really large code base of like, you know, compile times are really long and people are changing things that, you know, maybe cause the whole app to recompile even though they shouldn't, because, you know, they're not actually affecting that stuff. And that's when we were like seriously getting into modularization and tooling and stuff.
Yeah. And at that time, and I apologize for the really stupid question, I should probably know this, but that probably means that people who are listening also don't know this. If you're doing like a stock iOS app, right? What is the build system by default? I actually don't even understand that, right? Is that like, is there some Xcode script? Is it bash scripts? Like what is the build system there? Like, I mean, because I understand on Android, you know, obviously there's Maven and Gradle, and it's like there's stuff that I've at least heard of, but again, I should probably know this, but I don't, right? It's like, what is the default build system on iOS?
Yeah, you can maybe blame Apple for some naming confusion there. So like the IDE that everyone's using is called Xcode, right?
Xcode,
and the build system is called Xcode build. And so there's a command line tool called Xcode build that actually does the orchestration.
Got it.
Yeah, that's like your make analogy. Yeah.
Right. So at the time, I assume that Lyft was using Xcode build basically, right? It's like they had the normal build scripts or however people do it, you know, that would do a command line build of the app, like most other people, right?
Yeah, so we generally like had, totally normal stuff. We were using CocoaPods, you know, using Xcode build, all of this stuff. But, you know, once we found that we had, you know, a growing team of 80 plus or whatever, and like continued to have some growth there, every, you know, 2 minutes that you spend doing a pod install or whatever with CocoaPods or like waiting for extra build stuff is like probably worth trying to improve. And, you know, at this point, we maybe had 2 people working on tooling for iOS and 2 for Android as well. But you know, it's not like there was a massive investment or anything to try to improve stuff. You know, I mean, that was a really good like team size, but I'm just saying it's not like we had like 10 people trying to work on this.
Yeah,
it was a pretty reasonable size team compared to the 80 or whatever engineers we had working on features.
But at the time, is it safe to assume that the thing that people were complaining the most about was actually compile times, or like were there other issues that you would say were equivalently complained about?
Yeah, so when we were using CocoaPods, there were a lot of complaints about that because you had to do some amount of like base level overhead every time you like did a git pull or something like that. You know, when we were using like normal Xcode stuff, which means like checking in this Xcode project file, that's this giant XML file that's notoriously difficult to merge, like if you change something and someone else changed something, and your conflicts. And so there were a lot of complaints about that. But then compile times and then like general IDE slowness as well. Like regardless of all this other stuff, if you open Xcode and it takes a long time to like open a different file, or your code completion takes a really long time, like that was a frustrating thing as well. And, you know, so you kind of mentioned that we ended up like maybe moving to Bazel there, but there were a lot of intermediate steps that helped us get further along. You know, we replaced CocoaPods at some point and like pre-compiled all of these frameworks, which some other companies do with some other tools that are out there as well. But that like, you know, tossed this whole step of compiling third-party code all the time that you were never changing, except for the very rare occasion where we actually like bumped the version of some dependency. Yeah. And that was like a lot of custom tooling to do that because the off-the-shelf stuff maybe wasn't super widely adopted in the community, so it didn't really work very well. We also moved to this like Xcode project generator thing, which is really nice. So we stopped checking that file in, and you still had to generate something, but at least you know, skipped all these merge conflicts and all of that. Yeah. So there were some really nice wins there for developer experience. And really the build system like switch was a, you know, really big hammer after we spent, you know, I don't know, at least a year like working on other improvements. Because, you know, we didn't really want to jump into that without being super sure. I
mean, before we get into the whole adopting Bazel question, which I think is very interesting. One thing that I think is interesting on this topic, which I'd love to get your opinion on, is, and you know, I think we see this in different segments of our industry where, you know, you reach a certain scale and things go wrong, right? Like whether that's on your mobile app or in your microservices or something else. But in the mobile space specifically, one thing I'm curious about is why don't you think, even to this day, why don't Apple and Google invest more in like better developer experience for larger teams? Like, why is it left to every company to go and solve this problem? And the only thing that I can think of is that, they're obviously invested in the most apps that they can get, right? It's like they want the app store full of apps, and most apps are written by small teams who don't actually care about these problems. So maybe it simply is that, there just aren't enough large enterprises to actually make this worth it. At the same time, it confuses me because most of their revenue and interest comes from these large apps, right? So I would just love to get your opinion on like, why does every company solve what I feel like is literally the identical problem? Like, why aren't Apple and Google helping solve this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I totally agree with the sentiment. It kind of feels like, for one, I don't think the problems overlap a ton with the problems that they see internally because, a lot of these companies that have this type of problem are the singular monolithic app kind of companies, right? Like the Lyft type space where you have a very small number of apps and you have so many developers, as opposed to Apple or Google where you have a lot more apps and a lot fewer engineers maybe working on each individual app. So I think they hit a different set of problems often just because those products are different. I also think it really probably just comes down to a prioritization thing of like they're always working on whatever the new thing, especially with Apple, like they're always working on whatever the new thing is and supporting that new thing, and they're less focused on these types of inbounds that aren't super related to those.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that there could be another explanation, which is that Google certainly has solved this problem internally, right? I mean, they obviously have a well-known monorepo and the precursor to Bazel and all of those things. So it's like, and I guess to push back slightly, I'm sure there's hundreds of developers who work on the YouTube app, right? I mean, it's like these are like big apps. So I'm just, it's like I almost feel like they don't feel the pain, so they just don't care, I guess, right? And it's like I know nothing about Apple because their engineering is a lot more opaque to me, but I would imagine internally they have some build system that does something, right, for like large teams, and it's more, maybe to your point, they don't feel the pain, right? And it's a matter of priority. But it's one of those cases where it just seems like any app at any level of scale in terms of people is going to start hitting like these problems, and people just solve them over and over and over again. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I worry about with that is just that, because of how everyone's gone in these like divergent paths of solving things, like, I mean, maybe you could think of Bazel as some sort of unifying thing, but that's kind of maybe too high level. Like the specific problems that a lot of companies see are very different. For example, when we started using Bazel and other tools besides Bazel in the community, like, we had this all Swift code base that was, I don't know, at that point, like over 1 million lines of Swift code or whatever. And, no one else at that point was using those tools with that exact like shape of things. Like, Google was using Bazel and Swift, but they had like very little Swift and mostly still C++, right, Objective-C or whatever. And so I don't know, there is something to say about like the solutions are going to be different for many different teams. So it's not like, I'm not sure if you looked at, I want to go improve Xcode performance, like exactly where you would start. I don't know. Maybe that one's too easy because it is maybe more obvious how you would start that. But I feel like once you get past those one or two top things, it's a lot harder to figure out what the like slam dunk win is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like Apple does try to make strides in the right direction, but I think that it's never on the timeline that these companies are okay with, right? Like we switched to Bazel in 4 months or something at Lyft, and we are 7 years later, 6 years later, talking about like still having the same kind of issues. And so
for sure,
that's obviously not the right timeline, but even if it had been a year, it probably would have been too long,
So I guess take us back then, because I am curious, right? You're obviously you're trying to make Xcode build work, like you're trying to do all these targeted fixes. What led you down the Bazel path? And to be clear, for people that don't know the history, at that time, I don't know what year we're talking about. I don't know, 2017, 18, 19, like something along those lines. Bazel was pretty new back then and had a bunch of rough edges, right? So I'm just curious. And again, for those that don't know, Envoy adopted Bazel very early, and it was very painful. So I have some sense of the pain back then. So and like maybe you didn't know about the pain, like obviously until you started. But I'm just trying to understand, how did you decide, right, to go from these targeted fixes to saying, like, this is just not going to work, we have to do something different? And then once you said that, okay, something, how did you decide that something was going to be Bazel?
Yeah, totally. So before we kind of dove off onto this separate redesign project that I mentioned earlier, which took like a year maybe of time from Martin and myself and then some others throughout the process, I had actually done some sort of like evaluation in the community of like, if we wanted to move off of Xcode build, like what are our options? Or it wasn't specific to if we want to move off of Xcode build. It was much more like, how do we improve this at all? Like, even if that meant staying with Xcode build. But at that point I had evaluated Bazel and, Buck, which was out at the time.
Yep.
There was also this other like competing build tool. I think it was called XC build, and it was written by someone who was working at WhatsApp. And so there was like some interesting other options at that point. And honestly, at that time, it was like, none of these are going to work. Like, if we want to do anything, we kind of need to write it ourselves. And at that point, that was definitely like, we could have done that. And I think it would have been worse than what we had ended up with, but it would have been maybe okay. And actually that project kind of got +1, but then it kind of got on the back burner as I went and worked on this redesign instead. And then once I came back from that project, we still knew this was out here. And after we spent a while working on those other improvements I talked about, we kind of redid that evaluation. And in that time, Bazel had improved quite a bit. Like, when I looked at it originally, there was very little support for almost everything that we needed. And since, like you're getting at, it was so young, it wasn't really clear, like, to us from the outside as people who'd never worked at Google, like how hard it would be to add that stuff. And obviously stuff was moving very quickly. They were going through this like Java to Starlark thing and all that stuff. But during the kind of in-between period there, I think was when they open sourced the Apple rules, which were like the first big rules I think that they rewrote in Starlark. And that like was a really nice path towards reasonable like maintainability, because it was all out of this Java stuff and it was much more like specific to the Apple stuff. It felt much more approachable at that point.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, for those listening that don't know, the way that Bazel works is there's a core, right? And then there are these sets of things called rules, right? So I guess just in like 60 seconds, because people might not know, could you just like really briefly describe how this all works, just because it is kind of interesting?
Yeah, totally. So you can think of Bazel as maybe like a tool like Make or something that does some, actually let's use Bazel and CMake or something as like an analogy, maybe, where like Bazel is this core that like understands the kind of larger build graph, but then how you actually do things are written in rules. And I guess in the I don't want to stretch the analogy too much, because then it will require people understand the CMake Ninja setup as well. But the general idea is that like you have all this Java core that does all of the scheduling and all of this other build graph computation stuff, and you actually express the graph to the Java core through these rules that are written in this Python-like language. And the ideal is that all rules can be written that way. But in the past, everything was written in Java, and they just like made stuff work. And that's what evolved a lot over time. And that really paved the way to things being much easier for other people to contribute to, because you didn't have to understand all of this like, internal Java API stuff. You didn't have to know Java at all either. Like the Starlark API is very limited in what you can do for good reasons. And so you can write stuff, like if you have your own programming language or whatever, you can write a rule that like compiles your code and whatever in just a few lines of something that looks like Python and like be ready to go, which is really fantastic. And so that really changes how you'd maybe look at the tool for like how maintainable things could be and like how approachable it is if you know nothing about this tool otherwise.
So were there people at Lyft who pushed back on adopting Bazel? I mean, and it's like, what were the pros and cons, or like what were the alternatives considered?
Yeah, there were, I think as far as like the only two realistic options were move or don't, move to Bazel or don't. I think everything else in the community at that point had like kind of stagnated a lot, so there weren't really like those other options of like Buck or XC build or whatever, like had kind of stagnated. So I think the only other options were kind of like take some time to try to, improve other parts of the stack or whatever, but maybe you're not going to get the same type of 10x improvement. And so really at that point, it just came down to a bet. At this point, Martin was the director of that org, and I think he was, really willing to take bets like that and see how they played out. But, when we decided to do that, it was super not clear that it was going to be the right decision.
Yeah.
There was one other company who was like, I don't know if they had fully moved at that point, but the Pinterest had maybe moved or were moving at that point, but there wasn't much interest in Bazel in the community at all, and definitely not in the mobile space. I'd say in general at that point, there wasn't a bunch of like infrastructure expertise in mobile. I think most people who had gotten into mobile had done it because they were interested in making apps for the iPhone and not because they were like super deep in the tech stacks. So yeah, there weren't a lot of folks looking at this. Many companies didn't have much investment in this type of developer experience stuff.
All right. So now let's have some real talk. How many fixes did you do to the Apple rules to actually get it working?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot. Honestly, that was one of the parts that made us confident in being able to do it longer term. Is just naturally, like hundreds is the real answer.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think a huge part of it was what I mentioned earlier, which was Google's codebases, who were the only serious users of Bazel at that time, and our codebase could not have looked more different. Like they had C++ and Objective-C, we had all Swift, we had interface builder, like it was so different.
But hold on, just to be pedantic, because I actually was using Bazel during this time. Did Google even actually use Bazel? Because they were using Blaze, right? So
Right.
I mean, it's like, that's honestly, it's actually an honest question. It's not super clear to me in the late 2010s, was anyone at Google actually using Bazel?
Definitely not internally at Google. I think part of the draw for them to open source, if I understand correctly, was that there were open source libraries written by Google that they wanted to use Bazel with externally.
Yes.
Or they wanted to use Blaze with externally. And so
yes,
that was part of it. So like TensorFlow,
right.
And there were some other big ones that really mattered to them. So that was part of it. But no. But I think at that point, even like honestly, once the Apple rules were in Starlark, they were using that relatively unmodified internally at Google. So the internal and external versions were almost identical.
Got it. Okay.
And so, I think that at that point, the differences between Bazel and Blaze didn't really matter too much. I'm super appreciative, though, of the folks who were maintaining those Apple rules at the time. There was this guy, Sergio, who no longer works at Google, but he was super willing to accept open source contributions and like work with us on that stuff. And, without that, I don't know if we could have moved, because we could have forked it, but I don't think at that point we would have had the confidence in saying that was a good idea, right?
Yeah.
So he was actually merging stuff, which, meant testing it internally and everything too. And so that was like, that still to this day is like kind of a pain in the community, at least for non-Apple stuff, because I guess like the community owns the Apple stuff now. But yeah, so without some support from the Google folks there, like we definitely never could have made that move. But yeah, it took a ton of work to be able to do that. But I mean, the nice part of that was that we were very gradually ramping up on that project in a way that was like pretty approachable. It wasn't just like, oh, jump in and learn Bazel. It was like, we have this one problem, like where's the code that does that? Let's fix this. And it was a very incremental approach to really learning it, which was really great. And, we made so many fixes that were required for us to get anything working. And then we also were able to make a lot of fixes that help with performance and other things. So there were a ton of great things happening at that point for us to be able to use it. So yeah, I don't know, that happened for maybe like 4 months or something. I don't remember exactly what the timeline was. Like I remember having some functioning build in like December, and then I think we ended up merging in first CI or something in February or something like that.
Yeah, so I guess two questions. One, what was the end result? I mean, it's like, what did it do for the app build times? I guess that would be my first question. And second question, just because I love talking about bugs, what was the worst bug that you remember during the trying to get the build ported over?
Yeah, as far as like the outcome, I don't remember the specific times, but I mean, once we like stood up the cache and like got all of this other stuff working, and like there were multiple steps in between here, but I think we went from like a clean build, which would take like 20 minutes, which would happen in the normal state of development. It wasn't like, oh, developers cleaned and they had to deal with this. It was like developers would pull, and for some reason, Xcode build would decide everything was trash, and so it would do a clean build. That went from like 20 minutes to 1 minute or something. So like, the impact was so
big.
clear. And honestly, like after that, really, when you move to Bazel, I feel like it's not about that initial cutover. Like, obviously you have to prove a lot of value there, just, from a company perspective, but the value also comes like after that, because you continue to like keep that line kind of flat as you add code. Because like, after we did that migration, I worked at Lyft for another like 5 years, and people added millions and millions of more lines of code, and like the developer experience had to stay reasonable, right? So yeah.
Now you actually mentioned when you stood up the cache, and at that time there was no ngFlow, there was no build buddy or whatever it's called, right? And what did you do there? And actually, could you describe to people again very briefly, like the architecture of Bazel is a little different than most build systems, right? In terms of like local remote. And I actually didn't know that. I didn't know that Lyft had a cache that early on. I just figured it was actually added later. So could you tell us a little bit about that part?
Yeah, it wasn't immediately for sure, but the way that generally works is that, Bazel's really strict about the inputs and outputs of everything that it is doing in order to be able to reasonably prove that things can be identical between machines. So it encodes all the tools you're using and all the environment variables that are going into an action and things like that, so that if you build something on your machine and I don't have to build it on mine, I can just download the result of whatever you built. That's the general way that works. And so the back end to these is some sort of cache service that has like 2 different buckets of information, but generally Bazel just does tons and tons of HTTP requests and like uses all the bandwidth possible to like download the results of previous builds. There's another level of this where then once you know that things would be identical compiling on different machines, you can actually use remote machines instead, which gives you like wider parallelism depending on the build, which is super valuable in some cases. But yeah, so actually at that point, Lyft had this autonomous driving arm, and they were also using Bazel for their large C++ code base.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that they started using Bazel after we had moved to it, or maybe at the same time or something. We didn't really communicate with them too much about it because, again, we're like this all Swift mobile thing, and they are like this all C++ thing. It felt very different. But they actually had a much larger infra team than we did. They had like 4 people or 5 people working on their sort of infrastructure / Bazel stuff. And so they actually spun up a cache, which is one of the ones that you can still self-host today, called Bazel Remote on GitHub. And so we actually piggybacked on that for a long time.
Oh, okay.
And
interesting.
Yeah, so it wasn't a vendor one, but they spun it up. The problem with that cache was it would only run on a single node. There was no like sharding. And so they were just like getting the biggest AWS machine they could. And eventually that stopped working. And because it was just like the builds got too big, and I don't know, you're running out of reasonable performant disk space and stuff like that. I don't remember exactly what kind of fell over. And at that point, someone on our team from the Android side actually wrote a cache to use instead that was a bit more distributed and was using Redis for things. We used that for a while. I can't remember exactly how long and like when we moved over, but at some point after that, we moved over to Build Buddy, which was just a general much better experience because we offloaded all that work. So yeah, there were a lot of pieces there, but that's like one of the first things you want to do as soon as you're over to Bazel, because that's where a lot of the wins start coming in. But yeah, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but that was a huge, valuable piece.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I have some other questions about Bazel, but I guess prior to getting into that, just take us through the last part, because I know that you've moved on since then, and I know now that you're not even really focusing on mobile anymore. You're really focusing on the build stuff. So I guess just tell us a little bit about what you're up to now, and like what are some of the biggest challenges that you're working on these days?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I kept working on Bazel at Lyft for a while, but yeah, I decided to move on at some point. And, I was kind of interested in getting out of the mobile space. I mean, we can talk about that a bit, I guess. But yeah, I was still interested in working on developer experience, but wasn't really tied to continuing to work on iOS or anything. And so, yeah, I was kind of looking around. I was interested in the, what was exciting in tech at the point that I was moving, which was, I guess, 2023 or something at this point. So yeah, I ended up at Modular, which is a kind of an AI startup, and they needed someone to move to Bazel. At this point, they had some ex-Google folks who identified their kind of C++ build CMake set up as a bit of a problem. So I joined to do that. Migration, again, is a little bit different, but, since it's not mobile focused, I guess the problem space is a lot different because, definitely not being mobile, but also, we're working in this kind of GPU space. So there's a lot more variance in hardware, which is pretty interesting. We also have our own programming language called Mojo. And so there's like the C++ bit, and then there's, building this compiler, and then there's building the Mojo code, which also interops with Python. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that, we didn't really talk about, but Bazel really shines in this like multiple language interoperability story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, if we hadn't moved when we did, I feel like things would have looked a lot worse if we were like trying to move now or something, like if we'd gotten stuff working in the previous system. Because when you have a unit test that like runs Python, which then invokes a C++ compiler and then like invokes the Mojo compiler to like build a Python native extension to run some code, like, it's really nice to have some structured organization for how that works.
For sure.
That's the kind of stuff I'm working on now.
No, that's cool. And now we'll get more into the hot take section. I think what I want to pick your brain about a bit is, look, I totally get why people adopt Bazel. Like, there really is no other game in town when you have to do hermetic builds, you want to do parallel builds, you want to do caching. As you said, it really shines when you're dealing with multiple languages. At Bitdrift, we also use Bazel for our SDK because we're compiling Swift and Kotlin and Rust and all of these things. But I'll say this as nice as I can. Like, I have never met an end user of Bazel who is happy about using Bazel. Like, that person does not exist. Like, I would like to find that person. And I'm not sure exactly what it is. And maybe it's because when it works, it just works. But when it doesn't work for an end user, it's very difficult to debug and understand what's going on. Or, builds are supposed to be hermetic, but then they break and I expunge and then it starts working again, which is very frustrating, right? So I think my high level question is, builds are obviously so important to our industry. There is no software without builds, right? Yet at the same time, I feel like from a user perspective, build systems suck. I mean, it's like they're just like they're not very usable, right? So as an expert in this space, I actually just want to ask you first, do you agree with my sentiment, or do you think it's wrong and it's totally fine to disagree? If you agree with my sentiment, why? Like, why to this day are build systems not more end user friendly, right? I mean, it's like, that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that, it's easy for people in the infra space to actually like be kind of apologetic about it because you see like where the problems are and how complicated it is. But yeah, I mean, from my experience at Lyft and at Modular, most developers obviously don't want to or shouldn't need to care about build systems, and they should just be able to get their work done and that like mostly not be in their way. I think that there's a huge like last mile problem between Bazel and like meeting users where they're at. I think obviously some part of that people talk about all the time is like IDE experience in the Bazel world. It's like, if you pick up VS Code and you pick up a C++ CMake project, like you'll probably be kind of sort of fine or right out of the gate. And with Bazel, it's like you'll have to hire a Bazel expert to work for 6 weeks to make something work or whatever. Yeah. I think there's so much opportunity in that space. I think, similar to what we were talking about with Apple and like improving things for large orgs, I think part of the problem there is that even more so with Bazel, everyone's build looks slightly different and everyone hits slightly different problems and wants to make slightly different trade-offs. And so there's so little like unifying infrastructure for that type of thing, like for that last little bit, unless you're using a very specific IDE, like, in the Java space, if everyone's using IntelliJ, like maybe you can make something work. I don't know, with that plugin or something, but
yeah, it's like one of those areas that, again, I'm no investing guru, and I'm no like company business product guru, which I probably should be since I started a company, but that's a totally separate topic. Again, I find it confusing where like you have a company like Microsoft, which for all intents and purposes at this point, honestly, really owns the developer space. I mean, it's like, I don't know what the percentage is, but between GitHub and VS Code and all of these things, it's like the vast majority of users are bought into Microsoft, right? They're running their builds in CI, they're using VS Code, they're doing all these things. And it's like, why doesn't Microsoft have a more like ergonomic, scale out, hermetic system for these languages that's built into their entire ecosystem? And again, like it's obviously, I mean, they would do it if they thought that they could make money. And I guess on the same lines, it's like, you know, you probably have thoughts here. I know that over the years, Google's investment in Bazel open source has kind of like waxed and waned, right? So it's like sometimes Google's doing a lot of work. Sometimes they're just like, well, shit, I guess we're not going to support those rules anymore at all. I guess they're just community supported at this point. So I don't know, like, is it just one of those, this is the reality of open source, that until there's a company that kind of comes along and puts a nice fit and finish on it, it's just going to be a little rough around the edges. But at the same time, we have at least 2 Bazel companies now, and I don't feel like they've really made any strides in making it, you know, more and user usable. So, you know, again, I would just love to get your thoughts there. I just find it fascinating that we've been at this for so long. These problems are so consistent. I get that everyone's build is different, but there's lots of common themes in terms of the problems they're facing or the IDEs that they're using and all of those things. And it's like, you would think that at least with common languages and VS Code, it would be better, but it still kind of sucks. So like, tell us why. I mean, I just don't understand why.
Yeah, I think you're right about a lot of the investment stuff. I mean, also, you know, it feels like VS Code's been around forever, but like that did change at some point too. I think, you know, the reason Google doesn't feel very invested in this is because internally they have their web IDE that I think is heavily integrated with Blaze, and, you know, right, from what I hear, works great.
Sure.
I think, you know, a thing that's interesting about Bazel is I actually feel like there is opportunity for the companies you mentioned to improve this, because they have a sound business model with these remote cache, remote execution, like hosted services. And so they are able to invest in things like this. I think this one in particular feels like a big investment, right, for somebody to do, and like a big bet for them. And I agree with the thought about Microsoft is like, I'm not sure how much money is in there for that specific benefit. Like, I think it feels like a big dotted line to me to say, oh, if we get more people using Bazel, like they'll start using our product and paying us, and so we should do this thing. BuildBuddy actually did a project like that in the iOS space, where they hired someone who also worked at Lyft, whose name was Brentley Jones, and he made Rules Xcode Proj, and that was, you know, for this like bridging Xcode.
We use that. And, oh yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think everybody uses that at this point. It's great. Right. And, you know, he spent a long time working on that at BuildBuddy, and as far as I understand it, that was kind of the play was, hey, you know, this will get more iOS users here, and maybe they'll use BuildBuddy. So I think that they are uniquely positioned, I think, to improve that stuff. I think that's just a really big problem to tackle. And it feels tough with ID stuff because, you know, we've been talking about VS Code here, but here I am. I only use Vim. I don't use VS Code at all. So now you have this level of problem where it's like, now you've got to meet people where they are, and now you've got to support cursor and like all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
I just still feel like this area is ripe for, again, a better end user experience, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like there are companies out there that should care about this, but I guess they're too busy with their other business priorities. I'm coming at it again, just from an end user, and I am constantly frustrated, right? About like, I get why we need Bazel, but from a usability perspective and all the ways that we talked about, it just sucks, you know? And it's like, I feel like there has to be some middle ground, and I don't know how we get there, but I feel like as we've seen some consolidation in certain parts of the industry, like for example, I mean, does anyone remember companies like Circle CI and Travis CI? It's like, I mean, pretty much everyone uses GitHub Actions now, right? But that only works for, I would say, like traditional CI. They don't offer any of the fancy remote build, remote execution things. And I just, again, you know, whoever out there is listening, I just feel like there is some integrated solution here, at least for the common languages and the common setups. Maybe not Vim, maybe not every language, maybe not Haskell, right? But it's like, if you look at, you know, C++, Java, Python, Rust, it's like Go, you know, it's like the most common languages and the most common IDEs. I feel like one of these companies, whether it's one of the new AI companies or one of the traditional dev tools companies, I feel like someone's got to do something better here. So Anyway.
Yeah, this is a good time for me to pitch the Open Collective for Bazel Contrib, which is like an LF backed org that I helped found originally, and they have this open collective where they attempt to get companies to donate in this space and then offer bug bounties for this kind of stuff. I think there's a big disconnect. There's always been a big disconnect with that in open source, right? Where it's like we talk about how all of these major companies are using Bazel, but very few are like funding it. And I think also now Bazel's to a point where if you try hard enough, like you can like make it work without doing a lot of open source contributions. Not saying that's a good thing, but like when we started using Bazel at Lyft, like we had no choice if we really wanted to make it work for the long term. And so, I think that there's some opportunity there where you get some sort of funding in the right direction there to help out. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I really hope that, some of these companies who are already like profitable, or well, I don't know if they're profitable, but already stable in the Bazel space can invest some more in that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, anyway, we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but we are at time. Before we wrap up, just give us your, either your hot takes, or I'd love just to get your quick, especially in the build space, your 5 and 10 year predictions on like what do you think is going to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's probably a lot of possibility that people, especially new companies, spend a lot of time on programming languages that maybe take longer to get to the point where you want to build a system like Bazel, right? Like if you invest like in, if you, let's just say start today in like some Rust backend, you could probably go for a long time without worrying about that. I think there's a lot of potential in that versus all of these, companies that maybe started 10 or 15 years ago who felt like their only choice was to use C++, and now you like end up in this build system world or whatever. So I think that there's a chance that changes a lot over the next few years. But I'm also very interested to see what happens we didn't talk about Buck 2, but Facebook did like another version of their kind of build system. I think the interesting thing about that is that they took all of the learnings from Buck 1 and Bazel and then like improved on a lot of pieces. So I think there's a world where you have a build system that is inspired by Bazel that is not Bazel, that has the opportunity to improve some of that stuff. I think that's a long-term play because now the Bazel community is so huge and there's a lot of value in that, working cross-company to improve some of this stuff. But definitely interested to see where that goes, because I think that there's a lot of great pieces, but I'm not sure that this specific Java Google-owned code base will be the best thing to be using forever.
Cool. Well, thank you, Keith. I could keep talking for another hour. This was a super interesting conversation. So thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks, everyone. That's a wrap for this episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes. Huge thanks to Keith for joining and sharing his story. You can find this episode and all past ones on the Bitshift YouTube channel. And if you had fun, drop us a review, tell your friends, or yell your favorite hot take into the void. And just make sure to tag us. I'm Matt Klein, and I will see you next time. Thanks again, Keith.